The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of the military training facility as Thomas "Ghost" Mitchell stepped out of his weathered pickup truck. At 58 years old, his movements carried the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that survival often depended on making every motion count. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen more than most people could imagine. Ghost carried with him an old leather case that had traveled with him through 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless hunting expeditions in the mountains of Montana. Inside lay his most trusted companion, a traditional longbow crafted from yew wood, accompanied by a quiver of handmade arrows. The bow had been a gift from his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had taught him that sometimes the oldest tools were the most reliable. The facility buzzed with activity as some of the military's finest marksmen gathered for the annual precision shooting competition. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite snipers from various special operations units, each carrying rifles worth more than most people's cars. Their equipment gleamed with the latest technology: advanced scopes, laser rangefinders, and ammunition manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. As Ghost walked toward the registration area, conversations gradually died down. The elite snipers, mostly men in their 20s and 30s, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. His simple clothing, worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and old hiking boots, stood in stark contrast to their military-issued gear and tactical clothing. Captain Derek "Viper" Sampson, a 32-year-old sniper with more confirmed kills than anyone else at the facility, was the first to speak up. His voice carried across the registration area with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the best at everything he did. "Well, well, what do we have here? Looks like someone took a wrong turn on their way to the Renaissance Fair." The comment drew chuckles from the other snipers, and Ghost felt their eyes examining him like predators sizing up prey. He had faced this kind of skepticism before, in military briefings where his unconventional methods had raised eyebrows, and in civilian competitions where modern equipment dominated. "That's some interesting gear you've got there, Grandpa," said Lieutenant Jake "Razor" Thompson, a 29-year-old sniper whose precision with his custom rifle had earned him legendary status among his peers. "What's the range on that thing? 50 meters if you're lucky?" Ghost set down his case and began the registration process, his movements unhurried despite the growing audience. The competition organizer, Colonel Sarah Martinez, looked up from her paperwork with professional interest. She had heard stories about Thomas Mitchell, tales that seemed too incredible to believe about a man who could make impossible shots with primitive equipment. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, extending her hand, "I've heard quite a bit about you. I have to ask, though, are you sure you want to compete with that bow? This is primarily a long-range rifle competition. The targets are placed at distances up to 1,500 meters. The snipers around them erupted in fresh laughter. Sergeant First Class Mike "Phantom" Roberts, whose reputation for accuracy was matched only by his reputation for trash talk, shook his head in disbelief. 1,500 meters with a bow? Lady, I don't think even Robin Hood could pull that off. Maybe we should set up some hay bales at 50 meters and let him pretend he's at a medieval tournament." Ghost finished his registration and picked up his case. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried clearly across the now silent registration area. "I appreciate your concern, Colonel, but I think I'll be just fine." The confidence in his voice was understated but unmistakable, and it seemed to irritate some of the younger snipers. They were accustomed to intimidating opponents with their reputations and equipment, but this weathered man with his antique weapon showed no signs of being impressed by either. As the group moved toward the equipment inspection area, Sergeant Roberts decided to press his advantage. "Tell me, old man, what's your military background? Did you serve in the Civil War, or was it World War I?" Ghost stopped and turned to face the sergeant. For a moment, His eyes carried a weight that made Roberts take an unconscious step backward. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Ghost said simply. "Infantry first, then attached to Special Operations units for reconnaissance and target elimination." The mockery died down slightly, but Captain Sampson wasn't ready to back down. "Afghanistan, huh? What unit?" "Various," Ghost replied, offering no additional information. Those who knew anything about special operations understood that such vague answers often meant classified missions and highly sensitive work, but the younger snipers were too caught up in their own superiority to read between the lines. During the equipment inspection, Ghost's bow underwent scrutiny from officials who had never seen anything like it in a modern precision shooting competition. The bow was clearly handcrafted, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. The arrows were equally impressive in their simplicity, straight wooden shafts with carefully balanced steel points and fletching made from real feathers. "This thing must be at least 40 years old," muttered the inspection official, running his hands along the bow's surface. "Are you sure it's safe to use? I mean, the competition has liability concerns?" Ghost took the bow and demonstrated its action, drawing the string back to full extension with smooth, practiced motion. The bow's limbs bent gracefully, and when he released the tension, it returned to rest without so much as a whisper of sound. "She's never let me down yet," he said. The snipers watched this demonstration with growing amusement. To them, Ghost's bow looked like a museum piece, something that belonged in a display case rather than a competition against the most advanced shooting systems in the world. Their rifles featured computer-assisted targeting systems, environmental sensors, and ballistic calculators that could account for everything from wind speed to the rotation of the Earth. Lieutenant Thompson decided to share some technical information with Ghost, his tone condescending but ostensibly helpful. "You know, old-timer, my rifle here can consistently hit targets at 1,200 meters. The scope has automatic wind compensation and can calculate bullet drop to within a quarter inch. The ammunition is match grade, and the barrel is manufactured to tolerances you wouldn't believe." Ghost nodded politely. "Sounds like an impressive system." "It should be. It cost the taxpayers about $15,000, not counting the optics." Thompson patted his rifle affectionately. "What did that bow set you back? $50 at a garage sale?" The laughter from the other snipers was less enthusiastic now, but it was still there. Ghost's calm responses were beginning to puzzle them. They expected him to become defensive or angry, but he seemed genuinely unperturbed by their comments. As the morning progressed, the shooting began with standard qualification courses at various distances. Ghost surprised many by qualifying at every station, though his scores were solid rather than exceptional. At 200 meters, his arrows found the target consistently, if not spectacularly. At 400 meters, he continued to score hits that would have been respectable for a rifle, let alone a traditional bow. The elite snipers, meanwhile, were putting on a clinic in precision shooting. Their scores were nearly perfect at every distance, and their confidence grew with each round. Captain Sampson was particularly impressive, placing shot after shot within inches of each other at distances that would challenge most marksmen. "Not bad for a beginner," Phantom Roberts called out after Ghost completed the 600-meter course with a respectable score. "Maybe you should consider upgrading to a crossbow. You know, join the 20th century." The comment drew fresh laughter from the group, but Colonel Martinez was watching Ghost with increasing interest. She had noticed something that the younger snipers had missed. While Ghost's scores were not exceptional, his consistency was remarkable. Every arrow struck the target within a relatively small area, and his shooting rhythm never varied regardless of distance or conditions. During the lunch break, the snipers gathered around their equipment, sharing stories and comparing scores. Ghost sat alone on a bench, quietly eating a sandwich he had brought from home. His bow rested beside him, and he occasionally glanced at it with the kind of affection usually reserved for old friends. Viper Sampson decided to approach him, curiosity overcoming his earlier dismissiveness. "So, Mitchell, what's the story with the bow? I mean, why not use a rifle like everyone else?" Ghost finished his sandwich before answering. "My grandfather gave it to me when I was 12. He said that anyone can learn to shoot accurately with enough technology, but it takes real skill to hit what you're aiming at with simple tools." "That's a nice sentiment," Sampson replied, "but this is the 21st century. Technology exists for a reason. Why handicap yourself?" Ghost picked up his bow and ran his fingers along its length. "In Afghanistan, I carried both. The rifle for long-range work, the bow for situations where silence was more important than range." This caught Sampson's attention. "You actually used that thing in combat?" "When the situation called for it." Ghost's voice carried no boastfulness, just simple statement of fact. "Sometimes you need to take out a sentry without alerting his friends. Sometimes your primary weapon malfunctions. Sometimes you run out of ammunition." The other snipers had gradually moved closer, drawn by the conversation. The idea of using a bow in modern combat seemed absurd to them, but there was something in Ghost's tone that suggested he was serious. "What kind of range are we talking about?" asked Thompson. "I mean for actual combat use?" Ghost shrugged. "Depends on the situation. Most combat archery is close range, under 200 meters. But I've taken longer shots when necessary." "How much longer?" pressed Roberts. Ghost was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The longest confirmed kill I made with a bow was at 800 meters, Taliban sniper in a tower. Couldn't use a rifle because of the noise discipline requirements." The claim drew skeptical looks from the assembled snipers. 800 meters was a respectable distance for a rifle shot, and the idea of achieving it with a bow seemed impossible. 800 meters, Roberts repeated slowly, "with that bow." "Different bow, same principle." Ghost stood up and began preparing for the afternoon session. "But that's ancient history. Today we're just having fun, right?" As the afternoon session began, the competition moved to longer distances. The targets were now placed at 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters, ranges where even the elite snipers had to work hard for consistent hits. Ghost continued to qualify at each distance, though his scores remained merely respectable rather than outstanding. The snipers, meanwhile, continued their dominance. Their advanced equipment and extensive training showed clearly as they posted scores that would have been impossible with older technology. But as the day wore on, some of them began to notice Ghost's consistency. While their own performance occasionally varied with changing conditions, his remained steady. At the 1,000-meter line, Ghost's shooting drew more serious attention. His arrows arced high into the air, following ballistic paths that seemed to defy physics before striking the target with surprising accuracy. The snipers watched with growing interest, though their comments remained skeptical. "I'll give him credit," muttered Thompson. "The old guy's got more skill than I expected. But there's no way he can compete at the longer ranges. Physics is physics." Captain Sampson was less charitable. "He's shooting at targets the size of barn doors. My grandmother could hit them with enough practice." But Colonel Martinez had been keeping careful track of all the scores, and she was beginning to see a pattern that intrigued her. While Ghost's individual shots might not be spectacular, his aggregate scores were actually quite competitive. More importantly, his performance showed no degradation as the distances increased, a phenomenon she had never observed before. As the regular competition concluded, the colonel made an announcement that surprised everyone. "We have one more event today," she said. "An exhibition shoot at maximum range. The target will be placed at 2,100 meters, just over 2 kilometers. The distance drew excited murmurs from the snipers. This was beyond the range of standard military engagements and would test their equipment and skills to the absolute limit. Several of them began discussing wind calculations and ballistic trajectories, their voices animated with the prospect of attempting such an extreme shot. "Now," the colonel continued, "this is purely voluntary. It's an exhibition, not part of the formal competition. Anyone who wants to try is welcome." Ghost remained seated on his bench, apparently unmoved by the announcement. The snipers, however, were already planning their approaches to the challenge. 2,000 meters, Sampson said to his colleagues. "That's right at the edge of what's possible, even with our equipment. This is going to separate the real marksmen from the wannabes." He glanced over at Ghost, who was quietly inspecting his arrows. "I don't suppose the Renaissance Fair Reject is going to try his luck at this one." Ghost looked up from his arrows, his expression unreadable. "I might give it a try," he said simply. The response triggered a fresh wave of laughter from the snipers. The idea of attempting a 2-kilometer shot with a traditional bow struck them as so absurd that they could barely contain their amusement. 2,000 meters, Roberts gasped between laughs. "With a bow! Oh man, this is going to be better than cable TV!" As the group prepared to move to the extended range, Ghost stood up and slung his quiver across his shoulder. His movements remained calm and deliberate, showing no sign that he was affected by their mockery. But there was something in his eyes now, a focus that hadn't been there during the earlier, more routine shooting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything the elite snipers thought they knew about marksmanship, technology, and the power of simple tools in the hands of a true master. The extended range facility sprawled across a natural valley that stretched far into the distance. At 2,100 meters, the target appeared as little more than a speck against the backdrop of rolling hills. Even through high-powered spotting scopes, identifying the precise aiming point required careful attention and experience. Colonel Martinez led the group to the firing line, where shooting mats had been arranged at intervals wide enough to accommodate the snipers' equipment. The wind meters showed variable conditions, gusts ranging from 5 to 12 miles per hour, shifting direction every few minutes. Temperature readings indicated the afternoon heat was creating thermal layers that would affect bullet trajectories in unpredictable ways. "Gentlemen," the colonel announced, "and our distinguished veteran, you're looking at one of the longest shots available at any military facility in the country. The target measures 36 inches in diameter, with scoring rings down to the center X ring, which measures 6 inches across. Wind conditions are moderate but variable. You'll have unlimited time to set up, but only one shot each." Captain Sampson immediately began setting up his equipment with practiced efficiency. His rifle was a custom-built platform designed specifically for extreme long-range work. The scope alone cost more than most people's annual salary, featuring computer-assisted ballistic calculations and environmental sensors that fed data directly to the targeting system. "Unlimited time," he muttered to Thompson as he adjusted his bipod. "I'll need about 30 seconds to let my system calculate the solution. After that, it's just a matter of executing the shot." Lieutenant Thompson was unpacking his own equipment with similar confidence. His rifle featured a different approach to the same problem. Instead of relying primarily on computer assistance, it incorporated advanced materials and manufacturing techniques that provided exceptional inherent accuracy. The barrel had been manufactured using processes originally developed for aerospace applications, and each round of ammunition was individually weighed and measured. "The wind's going to be the real challenge," Thompson said, studying the grass and vegetation between the firing line and target through his spotting scope. "But my ballistic computer can account for most of it if I can get good readings." Sergeant Roberts had chosen yet another approach. His equipment represented the cutting edge of military sniper technology, incorporating lessons learned from combat operations around the world. Every component had been selected and tuned for maximum performance at extreme range. 2,000 meters is right at the edge of supersonic flight for my ammunition, he explained to the others. Once the bullet goes subsonic, accuracy drops off dramatically. but I've got hand-loaded rounds that should maintain velocity better than standard issue." While the elite snipers prepared their high-tech solutions to the challenge, Ghost simply walked to an open section of the firing line and set down his leather case. He opened it carefully, revealing the traditional bow nestled in foam padding that had been shaped specifically for its curves. Beside it lay a dozen arrows, each one individually crafted and perfectly straight. The contrast could not have been more dramatic. Where the sniper's equipment bristled with scopes, computers, and advanced materials, Ghost's setup appeared almost primitive. But as he began his own preparation routine, those paying attention noticed that his movements carried the same methodical precision as his more technologically equipped competitors. Ghost selected a single arrow and examined it closely, rotating it slowly to check for any imperfections in the shaft or fletching. He tested the point's sharpness against his thumbnail and adjusted the position of the feathers slightly. Then he set it aside and repeated the process with a second arrow and then a third. "What's he doing?" asked a young corporal who had been assigned to help with scoring and spotting. Colonel Martinez watched Ghost's preparation with growing fascination. "He's doing what any good marksman should do," she replied. "He's preparing his equipment and studying the conditions. The only difference is that his equipment requires different preparation than theirs." Ghost had strung his bow and was now testing its tension. He drew the string back several times, each pull smooth and controlled. The bow bent gracefully under the pressure, its wooden limbs flexing in perfect symmetry. When he released the tension, the bow returned to rest without vibration or noise. Captain Sampson had completed his setup and was now fine-tuning his scope adjustments. His ballistic computer displayed a constant stream of data: wind speed and direction, temperature gradients, barometric pressure, and even the angular position of the target relative to magnetic north. "System shows optimal firing solution," he announced to his teammates. "Elevation adjustment 31.7 minutes of angle, windage 2.2 minutes left. Ballistic coefficient calculations indicate bullet drop of approximately 43 feet with current atmospheric conditions." The technical precision of his preparation impressed the observing personnel. This was modern marksmanship at its finest, human skill enhanced by technology to achieve accuracy levels that would have been impossible in previous generations. Thompson completed his own setup shortly afterward. His approach relied more on traditional marksmanship skills, enhanced by superior equipment rather than computer assistance. "I'm showing similar numbers," he reported. "The thermal layers are going to be tricky, though. I can see mirage patterns that suggest the temperature gradient changes at least 3 times between here and the target." Roberts nodded as he made final adjustments to his rifle. "That's what makes shots like this interesting. All the technology in the world can't account for every variable at this range. Eventually, it comes down to reading the conditions and making the shot." Ghost had finished his equipment preparation and was now studying the range itself. But where the snipers focused on technical measurements and ballistic calculations, his attention seemed directed toward more subtle factors. He watched the grass movement at various points along the range, noting patterns in how the wind affected vegetation at different distances. He observed the flight patterns of birds in the area, noting how they adjusted their approach when encountering air currents. He studied the heat shimmer rising from sun-warmed patches of ground and the shadows cast by clouds moving across the sky. "Grandfather always said that shooting at long range wasn't about calculating the wind," Ghost said quietly, though his voice carried clearly in the still air. "It was about understanding the wind." The comment drew skeptical glances from the snipers who were deep in their technical preparations. To them, understanding the wind meant measuring its speed and direction with electronic instruments and feeding that data into ballistic computers. "Understanding is fine," muttered Sampson, "but at this range you need precision measurements. A 1-mile-per-hour error in wind estimation translates to a miss of several inches." Ghost picked up his selected arrow and knocked it onto the bowstring. The motion was smooth and automatic, suggesting thousands of repetitions over many years. He held the bow upright and made several practice draws, each one bringing the string back to exactly the same position. As he practiced, something remarkable became apparent to those watching closely. Despite the bow's traditional construction, Ghost's form and technique were flawless. His stance was perfectly balanced, his draw consistent, and his release clean and smooth. Whatever else might be said about his choice of equipment, there was no question about his fundamental skill as an archer. Colonel Martinez found herself genuinely curious about what would happen when Ghost attempted his shot. The mathematical realities seemed insurmountable. An arrow simply did not have the ballistic characteristics necessary for accurate shooting at such extreme range, but she had learned over her military career that expertise sometimes transcended what seemed mathematically possible. Captain Sampson took his position behind his rifle and began his final preparation sequence. He controlled his breathing, settled into his shooting position, and began the mental countdown that preceded every long-range shot. His spotter, Corporal Davis, provided continuous updates on wind conditions and target visibility. Wind holding steady at 8 miles per hour, quartering left to right. Target is clear. Mirage minimal at this time. Sampson's finger took up the slack in his trigger as his scope's reticle settled onto the target. The ballistic computer continued to feed him updated firing solutions, adjusting for minor changes in environmental conditions. After nearly 2 minutes of careful aim, he fired. The rifle's report was sharp and authoritative, echoing across the valley. Through spotting scopes, the observers watched the bullet's trace as it arced across the intervening distance. The flight time at such range was significant, several seconds during which everyone held their breath. The bullet struck the target with a metallic ping that carried faintly back to the firing line. Corporal Davis called out the result. Hit. Target shows impact approximately 4 inches right of center, 2 inches low. That's an 8-point shot. The result drew appreciative nods from the other snipers. At 2,000 meters, placing a shot within 4 inches of the point of aim represented exceptional marksmanship. Sampson looked satisfied as he cleared his rifle and stepped back from the firing line. Lieutenant Thompson took his turn next, using a slightly different shooting technique that relied more heavily on traditional marksmanship skills. His preparation was less hurried, involving careful study of the mirage patterns and wind indicators visible through his scope. "I'm seeing a thermal layer at about 1,200 meters, he reported to his spotter. "Going to adjust my hold to compensate for the vertical deflection." His shot, when it came, was followed by the same tense seconds of bullet flight time. The impact was announced as a hit within 3 inches of center, an even better result that drew respectful comments from his colleagues. "Outstanding shot," Sampson acknowledged. "That's textbook long-range shooting." Roberts followed with his own attempt, achieving a result similar to Sampson's first effort. All 3 elite snipers had demonstrated exactly what was expected from marksmen of their caliber: professional-level accuracy enhanced by superior equipment and extensive training. As the snipers discussed their shots and compared notes on technique, Ghost continued his own preparation. But his approach remained fundamentally different from theirs. Where they relied on measurements and calculations, he seemed to be developing an intuitive understanding of the conditions. He spent several minutes observing a hawk that was hunting in the thermal currents rising from the valley floor. The bird's flight pattern revealed information about wind conditions that no electronic instrument could provide, subtle shifts in air movement that occurred between different altitudes and positions. "Any time now, old-timer," Roberts called out with barely concealed impatience. "We don't have all day." Ghost nodded acknowledgement, but made no move to rush his preparation. He had selected his arrow and nocked it, but he continued to study the range with patient attention. His breathing was slow and controlled, and there was no sign of nervousness or uncertainty in his demeanor. The wind shifted suddenly, swirling dust devils across the valley floor before settling into a new pattern. The snipers checked their instruments and noted the change in their logbooks, but Ghost simply observed the new conditions with the same careful attention he had given to the previous ones. "Interesting," Colonel Martinez murmured to herself. She had begun to notice that Ghost's preparation seemed to follow natural rhythms rather than artificial timelines. He was waiting for something, conditions that his experience told him would be optimal for his attempt. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the range, and the thermal patterns were changing as different surfaces lost heat at different rates. What had been a complex but measurable set of environmental conditions was becoming even more challenging as the day progressed. "Conditions are degrading," Sampson observed. "Thermals are getting more unstable as the sun angle changes. If he's going to try this shot, he'd better do it soon." Ghost finally seemed to reach some internal decision. He raised his bow and took his shooting stance, the arrow nocked and ready. But instead of immediately drawing back the string, he stood motionless for nearly a minute, reading conditions that only he seemed to perceive. The elite snipers watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had demonstrated what was possible with modern equipment and professional training. Now they were about to see what a traditional bow could accomplish in the hands of someone who claimed unusual expertise with it. "This should be interesting," Thompson muttered. "I'm genuinely curious to see how close he can get." "Close?" Roberts laughed quietly. "I'll be impressed if he hits the hillside behind the target. 2,000 meters is fantasy range for a bow." Ghost continued his patient observation of conditions, waiting for the moment when everything aligned properly for his attempt. His grandfather had taught him that the difference between possible and impossible often lay in recognizing the right moment and having the patience to wait for it. The wind settled into a new pattern, steadier than before but from a slightly different direction. The thermal shimmer lessened as a thin layer of clouds filtered the afternoon sunlight. Whatever Ghost was waiting for seemed to be approaching. He drew the bowstring back in one smooth motion, the arrow coming to full draw with practiced precision. Unlike the sniper's lengthy aiming process, his hold at full draw was brief but absolutely steady. There was no tremor in his form, no indication of strain despite the considerable force required to hold a traditional bow at full extension. The observers fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The mathematical impossibility of what Ghost was attempting made it fascinating rather than merely impressive. Win or lose, they were watching someone challenge the fundamental assumptions about what was possible in long-range shooting. Ghost's release was clean and smooth, the arrow leaving the bow with a whisper of sound. Unlike the sharp crack of the rifles, his shot announced itself only by the gentle vibration of the bowstring returning to rest. The arrow arced high into the sky, climbing to an altitude that seemed impossible for such a simple projectile. Through binoculars and spotting scopes, the observers could track its flight as it reached the peak of its trajectory and began the long descent toward the distant target. At such extreme range, the arrow's flight time was measured in long seconds that seemed to stretch endlessly. Unlike a bullet's relatively flat trajectory, the arrow followed a high ballistic arc that required precise calculation of both windage and elevation. The silence on the firing line was complete as everyone watched the arrow's descent. It had become more than just an exhibition shot. It was a test of whether traditional skill could compete with modern technology, whether experience could substitute for electronic precision. The arrow struck with a sound that was barely audible across the distance, but the impact was clearly visible through the spotting scopes. Corporal Davis took several moments to examine the target carefully before making his announcement. When his voice finally cut through the silence, it carried a tone of disbelief that caused everyone on the firing line to check their own optics to confirm what he had seen. "Direct hit," Corporal Davis called out, his voice carrying a note of amazement that caused everyone to lean forward with their optics. "Arrow impact, center X-ring, dead center." The silence that followed this announcement was profound and absolute. Captain Sampson lowered his spotting scope and looked at it as if the instrument had somehow malfunctioned. Lieutenant Thompson raised his binoculars again, studying the distant target with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "That's not possible," Roberts said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The ballistics don't work. An arrow can't maintain accuracy at that range." Colonel Martinez had her own high-powered scope trained on the target and was conducting her own careful examination. The arrow was clearly visible, protruding from the exact center of the 6-inch X-ring, not merely within the center circle but precisely centered, as if it had been placed there by hand rather than shot from over 2 kilometers away. "How?" Thompson asked, turning to look at Ghost with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "I mean, seriously, how is that physically possible?" Ghost was already unstringing his bow, his movements calm and methodical. He showed no excitement or celebration, treating the shot as if it was exactly what he had expected to happen. His demeanor suggested that while others might find the result surprising, he found it routine. "Physics is the same for everyone," Ghost replied simply. "Arrows follow ballistic paths just like bullets. The difference is in understanding all the factors that affect the flight." Captain Sampson approached Ghost with a mixture of respect and confusion that had replaced his earlier mockery. "But the range, my equipment calculated bullet drop of over 40 feet at this distance. An arrow would drop even more, and the wind deflection—" Ghost finished packing his bow and stood to face the elite sniper. "Your calculations were probably correct for your equipment, but arrows and bullets behave differently in flight. Different ballistic coefficients, different responses to wind, different optimal trajectories." "But you didn't use any instruments," pressed Roberts. "No ballistic computer, no wind meters, no rangefinder. How did you calculate the firing solution?" Ghost picked up his case and slung it over his shoulder. "I didn't calculate anything. I observed the conditions and applied experience. Sometimes that's more effective than calculation." The statement drew skeptical looks from the snipers, who had built their careers on precise measurement and mathematical accuracy. The idea that observation and intuition could outperform their sophisticated equipment challenged fundamental assumptions about modern marksmanship. Colonel Martinez had been listening to the exchange with growing fascination. As a career military officer, she had seen the evolution of sniper technology from simple rifles with basic scopes to the computer-assisted marvels that now dominated long-range shooting. But she had never seen traditional methods produce results that exceeded modern capabilities. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "would you be willing to explain your technique? I think we'd all benefit from understanding how you achieved that shot." Ghost considered the request for a moment, then nodded. "Archery at extreme range is about reading conditions that instruments can't measure. Wind speed and direction change at different altitudes along the arrow's flight path. Temperature variations create air density differences that affect lift and drag. Terrain features channel airflow in ways that remote sensors can't detect." He gestured toward the valley between the firing line and target. "Your instruments told you about conditions here at the firing line, but my arrow spent most of its flight time in air that none of those instruments could analyze." Thompson shook his head in confusion. "But how do you measure those conditions without instruments?" "You don't measure them," Ghost explained. "You observe them. Watch how birds fly at different altitudes. Study how dust moves across the landscape. Notice how vegetation responds to air movement at various distances. Read the signs that are always there if you know what to look for." The explanation left the snipers more puzzled than before. They had been trained to trust instruments over intuition, to rely on technology rather than speculation. The idea that superior results could be achieved through observation rather than measurement seemed to contradict everything they understood about precision shooting. Roberts decided to challenge Ghost's explanation directly. "That's all very philosophical, but archery has physical limitations. Arrow velocity, ballistic coefficient, energy retention. The numbers don't support what we just saw. Ghost smiled slightly, the first time anyone had seen him display any emotion beyond calm competence. What numbers are you using for your calculations? Standard numbers for traditional arrows, wood shaft, steel point, feather fletching. I'm estimating initial velocity around 200 feet per second. Ballistic coefficient maybe 0.25. Those numbers would be correct for a hunting arrow, Ghost acknowledged. But this isn't a hunting arrow. He opened his case again and withdrew one of his remaining arrows for the snipers to examine. At first glance, it appeared identical to any traditional arrow, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences that spoke of extraordinary craftsmanship. The shaft was made from a type of wood they didn't recognize, harder and denser than typical arrow materials. The point was not simple steel, but appeared to be made from some kind of advanced alloy. Most notably, the fletching was not conventional feathers, but what appeared to be precisely engineered vanes designed for optimal aerodynamic performance. Carbon fiber core with hardwood laminate, Ghost explained as they examined the arrow. Titanium alloy point with ballistic profile optimized for long-range flight. Synthetic fletching with computer-designed geometry for maximum stabilization and minimum drag. Thompson weighed the arrow in his hand and immediately noticed the difference. This thing is heavier than I expected, but it's perfectly balanced. What's the ballistic coefficient? 0.68, Ghost replied. Initial velocity from my bow is approximately 320 feet per second. Retained energy at 2,000 meters is sufficient for target penetration. The numbers changed everything. What the snipers had dismissed as impossible suddenly became merely extremely difficult. An arrow with those specifications would behave more like a bullet than traditional archery equipment, maintaining velocity and accuracy at ranges far beyond normal expectations. "Where did you get these arrows?" asked Sampson. "This isn't commercial equipment." "I make them myself," Ghost replied. "It's a hobby that grew out of necessity. When you need equipment that doesn't exist commercially, you learn to create it yourself." Colonel Martinez was studying the arrow with the eye of someone who understood advanced materials and engineering. "Mr. Mitchell, this represents some serious research and development. How long did it take you to develop this technology?" "About 15 years of trial and error. Materials science, aerodynamics, manufacturing techniques. I had to learn it all from scratch. The military didn't have much use for improved archery equipment, so it was a personal project." Roberts was beginning to understand the scope of what Ghost had accomplished. "You essentially created a hybrid system, traditional archery techniques combined with advanced technology, the best of both approaches." "Something like that. The bow provides the advantage of silence and simplicity. The arrows provide the ballistic performance necessary for extreme range work. Combined with proper technique, the system can be very effective." The revelation recontextualized everything the snipers thought they had witnessed. Ghost hadn't achieved the impossible through mystical intuition. He had used superior technology combined with exceptional skill to outperform their conventional equipment. But that realization led to new questions about his background and experience. Creating such sophisticated equipment required knowledge and resources that went far beyond typical military training. "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Martinez said carefully, "your service record mentioned attachment to special operations units. What exactly was your role?" Ghost was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. "Research and development," he said finally. "Testing unconventional approaches to long-range target elimination. Some projects worked out better than others." The vague answer suggested classified work that couldn't be discussed in detail, but it explained how Ghost had acquired the knowledge and resources necessary to develop his advanced archery system. It also explained his calm confidence in challenging elite snipers with seemingly primitive equipment. Captain Sampson was studying Ghost with new respect. "You set us up," he said with dawning realization. You let us assume you were just some old guy with traditional equipment when you were actually using technology more advanced than ours. I didn't set anyone up, Ghost replied mildly. You made assumptions based on appearances. I just didn't correct those assumptions. The distinction was important. Ghost had never claimed to be using primitive equipment. The snipers had simply assumed that his traditional-looking bow represented outdated technology. Their mockery had been based on their own prejudices rather than any deception on his part. Thompson was examining the implications of what they had learned. If you can achieve this kind of accuracy with an improved bow, why isn't this technology being used operationally? It is, Ghost said simply. Just not widely. Special applications require special equipment. Sometimes silent, long-range capability is more important than raw firepower. The statement suggested that Ghost's archery system was still in use by specialized military units, even if its existence wasn't widely known. The snipers began to understand that they had encountered someone whose expertise went far beyond anything in their own experience. As the group prepared to leave the range, the dynamic had shifted completely. Where Ghost had arrived as an object of mockery, he was now departing with the respectful attention of professionals who recognized superior skill and knowledge. Mr. Mitchell, Colonel Martinez said as they reached the parking area, would you be interested in conducting some training sessions? I think our personnel could benefit from learning about alternative approaches to long-range work. Ghost considered the offer while loading his equipment into his truck. I might be able to arrange something, he said, though I should mention that the archery system isn't the only unconventional technique worth exploring. The comment drew immediate interest from the snipers, who were beginning to realize that their encounter with Ghost might be just the beginning of a broader education in capabilities they hadn't known existed. What other techniques? Asked Thompson. Ghost smiled as he closed his truck's tailgate. Well, there's the modified slingshot system I developed for urban environments. Effective range out to about 800 meters, completely silent, uses improvised ammunition. Then there's the pneumatic dart gun for situations requiring non-lethal precision. As he drove away, Ghost could see the snipers in his rearview mirror, clustered around Colonel Martinez in animated discussion. He had accomplished more than just making an impressive shot. He had opened their minds to possibilities they hadn't previously considered. The mockery had ended the moment his arrow found its mark, replaced by the kind of professional respect that could only be earned through demonstrated competence. But more importantly, he had challenged their assumptions about the relationship between technology and skill, showing them that innovation often came from combining old wisdom with new capabilities. Years later, when those same elite snipers had become instructors themselves, they would tell their students about the day an old man with a traditional bow had taught them that expertise couldn't be measured by the sophistication of equipment alone. They would explain that true marksmanship required understanding conditions that no instrument could measure and applying experience that no computer could calculate. And sometimes, late in the evening when the day's training was complete, they would gather around whoever had been there that day and ask them to tell once more about the shot that had defied possibility, the arrow that had traveled over 2 kilometers to find the exact center of a 6-inch target, silencing the doubts of elite snipers who had learned never to judge capability by appearance alone. The legend of Thomas Ghost Mitchell's impossible shot would grow over time, inspiring a generation of marksmen to look beyond conventional approaches and consider what might be possible when skill, innovation, and patience combined to challenge the limits of what was thought achievable.